Welcome everyone to our session, Resilient Cities, Play and the Return to Public Space. I'm not only very excited for this session, but I think it's part of the future of where I think Games for Change is going. When Games for Change began, a lot of the excitement was over purely digital games. And we were excited just that they could be on computers also and not just on consoles. There's we could even reach mass markets through the web, the internet. So things have changed a lot, but I think that but cities in some ways are going to change things even more. And we're starting to see some of that, including with apps like Pokémon GO, which we're going to talk about a little bit today. This is a roundtable, and I'm thrilled to have a conversation really beginning between groups that really, I think, are not often here together. People that do traditional urban and city placemaking and game design companies. And I think that those two are coming together in some interesting ways. I should introduce myself. I'm Benjamin Stokes. And I'm a professor at American University, where I teach in our game design program and around civic and social issues. I've been passionate for the past, 5+ years about games and cities. And I just put out a book. This is like my little promo called Locally Played that's around some of this. And as part of the work in the book, one of the things that kept coming back to me is how many of our most pressing social issues today have really deep roots in cities. And if we can't think about public space, and if games have nothing to say and play has nothing to say to cities and public space, then I think that we're missing some of the most important social issues of our time. I would argue that the return to public space after the coronavirus is something that is in so many ways mediated by community norms and how we connect to each other. And certainly the issues around Black Lives Matter and protests around systemic racism are often tied back to questions about community accountability and what kind of control our communities have over their own conditions. So I think that we're going to be talking a little about some of these issues and how games relate to these big questions. I think they do. I think our panelists may have come from very different places on this, but they're here because I think they have something to say also about cities and resilience. I'm going to let them do some of the introduction, but I also want to anchor where I am in terms of cities. So hello, I'm coming from Washington, D.C., a particularly interesting local place because it also has such national attention focused on it right now. But D.C. is very much a city, and I'm going to hand it over next to Yennie Solheim, who is joining us. And I want her to say a little, not only of what organization she's with, but what city are you in, and why are you interested in cities and resilience? And we'll just do very quick intros, and then we'll start into a conversation that will last for about 30-40 minutes until we start opening it for more questions from the audience. This is really trying to start a conversation, not just among the panelists, but the Games for Change community. All right, over to you, Yennie. What city are you in?
Thanks, Ben. I'm right in the heart of San Francisco, living in the Castro district. And I lead social impact at Niantic. Niantic is an augmented reality technology company. We make games that people have to go outside and play in normal times. And one of the biggest games that we've made is Pokémon GO, which was launched in 2016. Our deep interest is really in connecting people with their communities and figuring out how we can use technology to enhance that. So I'll leave it there and pass it on to Nidhi.
I'm sure there's now everyone watching is like, I have so many questions about how Pokemon Go looks in this crazy time. We'll get to that in just a second. But let's turn it over to Nidhi, who I think is comes from a place not of video games or digital game creation at all. She's the senior director at Project for Public Spaces. And I think that some of our audience with games might not even know what that organization is. So can you tell us a little, even though actually anyone in placemaking would be like, these are the people you should be talking to. But Nidhi, tell us a little bit about what city you're in and what brings you here.
Right. I am joining everybody today from Astoria, Queens, my beloved neighborhood in New York City. I work for Project for Public Spaces, as Ben said. I'm a senior director of programs and projects. I've been with the organization about 6 years. We are a planning and design nonprofit, and we practice placemaking. Our organization was one of the first that started using placemaking as a term in creation of cities as really a human-centered approach. So you'll hear a lot more about that And we play every day in public spaces. That's kind of our arena of change. So our mission is to strengthen communities through community-based investment in their public spaces. And I'm happy to talk about that more. I'm very excited to be joining the panel today.
That's fantastic. And I think that maybe just to give one little fact that people might find interesting, I think a lot of the excitement around games is that they are a mass media. We can reach a lot of people and have a big impact. But I think one of the surprising facts about cities is that they actually are also at scale. They are at massive scale. So much of the planet lives in or near cities, and also play spaces are at pretty large scale. Kaboom, for example, an organization that does build playgrounds, has renovated something like 17,000 playgrounds. That's a pretty large install base. If you think of that's just the playgrounds, not even the number of kids that visit those spaces. So one of the starting points I want to urge us to think about in this panel is that cities are already at large scale. And if we figure out how to engage them with play, we can have a pretty sizable impact. Of course, Pokemon Go, I think, opened the conversation on scale and games in place. So maybe, Yennie, can you tell us a little bit about, before we get into the pandemic and some of the changes that we've seen, how do you think about how Pokemon Go has helped connect people to their cities and place through play?
Yeah, well, what's really interesting about Pokemon Go is that it's built based off of game locations. And those game locations are things like art sculptures, murals, places of public interest. So a person has to physically move towards that place in order to interact with the game in normal times. And I'm happy to go into how we've adjusted based on COVID measures. But that's I think, the key piece in engaging people in their communities is making the world around them playable. So if you think about all of the historically significant and culturally significant places in your neighborhood, those can become play places. So maybe even the building that you live in. And when you physically have to be in that space in order to interact with the game, you're encouraged to pause and consider the place that you're in. And you might even interact with other people who are also playing the game. And that's just what we saw with Pokemon Go, and frankly, with all of our games, is this really interesting interaction between people who were maybe coming from different backgrounds, and all of a sudden they had a shared. We've heard from a lot of players that the games have helped them meet new friends, even new partners. A couple have had babies, especially from the Ingress community. And that's a really special thing that you don't often hear about these games. And what really inspires us at Niantic is to think about how we can continue to encourage that connection between people and places, and think about how communities can come together in a more cohesive manner because of that.
Let's turn it over to you, Nidhi. When you think about connection to place, is play like a very important tool? Why is play useful when you're trying to build a connection to place?
I think it's very, very important as an applied tool and as an experience to have in public space. Because play, if you think about it, play is by its very nature interactive. You're either interacting with each other, you are interacting with a thing, you're interacting with either on your device or a built thing. It's inherently interactive. You have to be interacting with something for it to be playable, for it to be playful, for you to be playing. And by interaction is what you create meaning in your mind. By interaction is what you create stories in your mind. And at the end of the day, it's those connected stories that create a sense of place in your mind. So play is very important as an applied tool, as a concept, and as something that brings people together, potentially from different walks of life, different age ranges, kids and their parents, and stuff like that. So it's a very important tool.
Yennie, have you been seeing people that are really different from each other connect through play? I've argued this is one of the most important things that play does, perhaps even better than anything else, is that it creates a space for people who don't know each other to meet their neighbors or kind of start connecting. Do you generate cross generations, lines of race and class? Do you have any examples, or how do you think about that, Yennie?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it depends on the game. So different games attract different kinds of people. Pokemon Go is definitely one of the more diverse games. Harry Potter Wizards Unite is also extremely diverse. The gender ratio there is really even. And what's exciting to think about is how people from different backgrounds, right, different races, different cultures, religion, age, bond over something, seemingly so simple. And all of a sudden, there is a connection point between people who might not otherwise agree or spend time together. And we've seen it over and over again. A lot of our live events are great examples of different people coming together. So for example, every year we host something called Pokemon GO Fest, which is a live event, usually in 3 cities around the world. This year it's actually virtual, so anyone, anywhere around the world can join. But you see 50,000 people come together in a park, and they're flying in from all over the world. And it's really stunning to see the difference, right? People from all walks of life, trading friend codes, meeting up, talking about how they play the game versus how someone else might play the game. And it's really neat for us to see. It's definitely different than what I think a lot of people might assume the games industry looks like, right? The traditional demographic is not quite lined up with how Niantic is creating games.
Yeah. I was intrigued. I did some research with Niantic and the Knight Foundation about a series of big Pokemon projects they were doing in different US cities. I flew out to San Jose and looked at an event they were doing there to extend a 100,000 person event. The event was already 100,000 people, and a one-day event, they added Pokemon Go and brought in 30,000 more people. And it was almost like bringing in, we already had the bikers and the walkers and now the players. And so it was a really interesting kind of comparison to think of this as something that's just like part of the toolbox of cities. We can decide when we want to make these kinds of invitations. And I think play always begins with an invitation. Good play you can't assign to people. You try to kind of see if what they want to do. And in San Jose, one of the things that caught my eye was the players were exchanging a little bit of personal information with their names or handles. They started to know the names of people who were at the same spots they were at. They could say, I interviewed them and asked, can you say anything about the people around you? And they could name little bits of information. But when I asked the same questions of the bikers and walkers, most of them actually hadn't talked with the people next to them. They were really excited to be near, to be kind of like physically proximate to a walker, but it actually takes a lot to like start a new conversation with somebody next to you. When do you get to that point? And I think that this to me is actually one of the cool things about digital games is you can actually start a little of that privacy, vulnerability, telling people who you are, negotiation earlier with information that's a little bit personal. It's a name you picked, but not entirely something that is random or arbitrary either. At the same time, it was clearly something that the city of San Jose had designed and worked on with, they picked the route and worked on with Niantic. And that seems so different in some ways to a lot of how we design play in other public spaces. Nidhi, I'm kind of curious for you, when you're going to design, whether it's a playful event, like a street festival, or something like an area for volleyball or something. How does that design process begin? Let's talk a little about how we get to the point of play.
Right, absolutely. So I want to pick on a little bit about engagement with somebody from a different walk of life than you. That's a very crucial point from a placemaking applied in city design perspective, because that is the whole point of placemaking existing, I would say. Because if you think about public space, that's like space literally outside of kind of your property line. I would even argue that it's space outside of your building wall. Everything else, we perceive it as one, it's one space, and it's kind of the connective tissue of our city. And it's intended and it should be common ground because it's public space, it's for everyone. But the reality is that nothing is almost inherently equitable. Almost nothing is common ground. You have to be very intentional about how do you create a sense of invitation for people who don't feel invited? How do you create a sense of power for people who don't feel empowered in their city? So that interaction between people from different walks of life has to be very, very intentional. So if we were to like actually think about it from a placemaking process perspective, the first thing that you would want to do after you identify a city or a neighborhood that you're working in, you really want to identify who your priority audience is. And the way that I would go about identifying that priority audience is who has less access and who has less power. Because the people who have least access don't find their way to public spaces. So how do we make it easy for people with the least amount of access and power to get to their public spaces? And then everybody else with more power and access will automatically get there, and that interaction would occur. So my personal research focus area is 3 levels of priority. I look at vulnerability based on age. So kids is a very important population. Vulnerability based on gender, because female identifiers for generations and centuries have been marginalized. So gender is another consideration, female identifiers and other genders. And then the third is by incomes, because we know that income is a factor of race, culture, class. How much you make has a lot of baggage built within it. So if you apply those 3 layers, end up with a demographic which is young girls in poor neighborhoods. They are my priority audience. So if I were to think about closing the street and creating an activity there, I would think about that young girl and her caregiver. What is the kind of activity that would bring them out? And then everybody else, as I said, with more access and power would automatically find a way there. And if you see the vulnerable people enjoying and thriving in your public space, that creates a really important point of interaction and reflection for a community. And even if it's not, because it takes a lot, as you said, Ben, for somebody to come up and actually talk to you. I think it's a reach for public spaces to expect people to actually be able to talk to each other, because that requires too much comfort. We're not there yet, but even if we can begin to see each other in space, even if people with more privilege and more access can see a little girl from a marginalized low-income community playing and thriving in a public space and their caregiver being equally happy and thriving, that in itself would take our society to a whole other level. And in ways that we talked about Pokemon, we can make that happen. That's a bonus.
Yeah, that I was to mention Pokemon Go one more time with the San Jose example. I found one of the things when I interviewed some of the city staff there, they said that when they'd been running this event, San Jose is a very diverse city, and they said they were getting a great Latino turnout for the event. They had plenty of white people, they said, but they said that they couldn't get a lot of the Asian population that they wanted just to be representative. So they were underrepresented at the existing event. And one of the things that they said they loved about Pokemon Go is it was actually a demographic balancer. It brought out more folks from Asian backgrounds. And that was actually one of the city's goals in bringing that up. And I think that to me, that's great. As long as there's some control over that too, can we get different demographic groups at different times for different cities? I think that you can. Philadelphia, for example, did very different things in partnering with Niantic. We can get into that, but I'm kind of curious on Yennie's take. How do you ensure equity, since you in some ways are a platform that's serving lots of places at the same time? You can't go in and serve, you personally can't be in every community. Is partnership kind of your strategy, or how do you do some of this kind of listening to the community?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's a multi-pronged approach because our games are played almost everywhere in the world. There's a lot of listening that has to happen really cross-functionally. If we're thinking about from an internal perspective, how do we listen and react? It's across operations, engineering, product, design, marketing, comms, the whole gamut. So there's a lot of listening, a lot of discussion. We learn and we iterate based on what we see, right? So the pandemic has actually made us think a little bit more about how we can make the game more accessible to people who might not be able to go outside, for example. We're huge proponents of the benefits of going outside and engaging with one another, but not everyone can do that even in pre-pandemic, post-pandemic times. And so it's given us a really good opportunity to think about how we might adjust our gameplay based on that. So we spend a lot of time ensuring that the listening is happening across lots of different, just, the most vocal folks, for example. We really want to spend time asking questions of people who represent all different kinds of groups. And I think that's kind of what Nidhi was mentioning too, is thinking about, you know, how is that young girl with her caregiver going to experience an event? And really spending the time to consider that perspective versus just considering the classic gamer perspective, because that's not who we are. You know, there's so many people that play these games casually that are, let's say, a Hispanic mother of 5, right? Like it could be anyone. And so instead of just thinking about one prototype, we spend lots of time thinking about listening to lots of different folks and then adjusting as we go, because that's ever evolving.
From a product design standpoint, in some ways that's kind of crazy talk. It's like you're supposed to pick your target user, maybe a couple target users. But what you're saying is like, be radically open to like all kinds of users and how they would connect. Nidhi, if we're trying to draw from the fact that public spaces have been designed with stakeholders for a long time, do you have guides? Let's say somebody is a new person in a planning department and they've never been in the planning department. What's the first thing you give them? And could we give that to a game designer and say, if you're going to design for cities, you should use this? Like, what kind of tools would you give people?
So we do have publications. There is a Placemaking, Making It Happen book that's available on our bookstore, which was down for just a moment. It is live back up for ordering books now. Project for Public Spaces, pps.org. It has a bookstore. You can go there and find it. But we have tons of other tools available also, which is like Placemaking 101 level of tools. And all of them, again, bring this human-centered approach forward, that you have to understand who your priority audience is in order to engage them better. And there is no lack of data to show you who your priority should be, like who needs public space the most. And an equitable approach is probably the only way, I think, is the way to go forward, because as I said, public space is the common ground. And whoever needs that common ground the most and whoever has the least access should be prioritized. So that understanding that priority audience is step one. Step two is understanding that priority audience's willingness to engage, ability to engage, and preference to engage. How would they want to engage with you? Do they want to go to a traditional public meeting where some guy stands in front of you, shows you a proposal for a new park, a street, or whatever, and then you react? Reaction takes a different level of power and access again. So not everybody wants to go to a public meeting. So if your priority audience is that young girl and her mother, English is not their first language, they're my family, like I can put faces on it, then you would want to understand, do they want to engage with you in a survey format? Or do they want to have just a casual conversation, 15 minutes over the phone? Or do they want to submit an anonymous tip of how they would want to use their public space? Whatever their preferences, build a community engagement strategy that reflects the preference of your priority audience, and then go out and conduct that community engagement. So asking a lot of questions is kind of the basic of placemaking. And then most of us who do this kind of work, we are qualitative researchers. I have a training in qualitative research. So you take the information that you gather from the community and utilize your qualitative research synthesis skills to come up with the kind of recommendations that, again, represent what the community needed. If they can't see themselves in the product, they're not going to come. And that's just the reality of public spaces in many spaces. So that would be the kind of the process where you first have to identify your priority audience. I want to touch on something that I've been seeing going on in the chat.
Yeah.
It's a little bit about how people are potentially fleeing public cities and how there's more influx towards rural areas and smaller towns. I think, again, we have to think about who has access to that, who can up and leave, and who has been providing essential services and requires that economy of scale to really have a livelihood. So not everybody even has the ability to leave a city. And that shows, again, the fractures in our systems of who has access and who doesn't. The other thing I want to talk about is, pandemic. This is the first pandemic of many, many to come because of climate change. And a response to climate change from the built environment perspective, city and urbanism, the place that I'm sitting in, requires critical densities for public transportation to work, for people to be able to walk meaningfully and cycle meaningfully. So even though our big cities may not be the same, we still need to be thinking about density even at a smaller scale. So rural towns really thinking about infill and creating that that opportunity where people can meaningfully walk somewhere, people can still meaningfully cycle, take a bus, and things like that, so that we can potentially stop climate change in its tracks and avoid further pandemics, because the fight or fight reaction is only two reactions. There needs to be a third of like meaningful action and strategic action.
I wanted to go back to what you were saying a second before that, as we start thinking about climate change, just to emphasize the contrast between what games industry often does and what you're talking about. Some of the qualitative methods about talking to a lot of people and being really open, in some ways contrast pretty radically, I think, with the game industry standard. If we're talking about like games user research, and for those that don't recognize, this is like a huge part of commercial games. If you're a major game publisher, like let's say you're Microsoft, you have a whole ton of social scientists who test your games. And this is something that didn't always exist, but what we've realized is, developers tend to think my game's ready, and the publishers are like, no, there's a lot of things you need to fix. But it's all games, it's the title, games user research, it's all on the user, and the user is an individual. I think a lot of what Nidhi's talking about is when we're talking about cities and places, it's not just that we need to be user-centered, but we're kind of need to be community-centered. I think that means it's twice as hard, because you can't just serve the needs of the individuals. A lot of the flight from cities is a phenomenon that's like individuals are going, if you have a second home, that's great, but that's like an individual response. And that doesn't work if it's a collective problem. If it's a problem that requires group solutions, shifts in group norms, what kind of neighborhood do we want that's safe? If we only say the rich are going to run to their place, and some of that is certainly going to happen. I don't think we're in a position to stop that. But I think it's also a question of, well, what are we doing to shift the norms in places, especially for issues like climate change? Maybe to push this a little to Yennie, I'm curious about whether you feel like some of the testing for Pokemon Go and Ingress and the games that you work on does have this kind of community-centeredness in a way that's different than user testing, and maybe pivot that a little to have you seen any of those indicators under the pandemic? How are you listening to your community? Is it just listening to users, or in some ways are you hearing things from communities?
Yeah, so I heard a couple of questions in there. I think the first thing to say is that we are very pro-community, and that's, community as a whole. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of our players are very casual players and not necessarily ones that would play World of Warcraft, for example. And then there are also those players. So there's a wide range there. We certainly have seen community evolve a bit with the pandemic. We've been adjusting our game features to allow for things like, long distance connections, right? So instead of having everyone come in the same physical space, there are ways for people to come together in a virtual space and or participate in the same event, 500 miles apart. The thing that I started thinking about, Ben, when you were talking about this, is that our hope is that community-driven learning and listening happens beyond just games. Augmented reality technology is hugely powerful, and there are so many more applications that exist beyond games, right? Pokemon Go, Harry Potter, Wizards Unite, and Ingress are all wonderful, and we love them. But there are a lot of really interesting ways that we can think about using the technology to engage everyone in these communities, because much to my dismay, not everyone is going to be playing these games. And so we're thinking a lot about how we can apply the underlying tech to community engagement and listening that's beyond just the smartphone, for example, which, by the way, not everyone has, right? So you have to think about the accessibility as well there.
Nidhi, how have you been thinking a little about the return to public space, and do any of play spaces change? I mean, the obvious one is that playgrounds were totally shut down at the beginning, and now maybe it's a little easier if we think of it as perhaps the virus less being about touch and more about breathing and distance. But there's so many people that are trying to figure out, how do restaurants return to public spaces? Do we close streets? What are the debates among placemakers? You guys are right at the center of what a bunch of cities are debating and talking about.
There's lots of stuff that has not changed, but brought to the forefront since this pandemic. The biggest concern that has come forth because of this pandemic is who has access to public space. Because we've seen COVID-19 unfold, everybody has to shelter in place. And when people live in the kinds of units where even I live, I don't have a backyard, I don't have a front yard. I rely on public space for getting outside. And then you realize that not everybody has access to being outside. And what impact does it have on your mental health, your social health, and other things? So that's the biggest thing, like who has access to public space. And we need to accelerate the advocacy efforts that talk about equitable access, that talk about filling gaps in communities that don't have any parks, that don't have streets where you can walk, and other things. So that's at a systems level where there has been conversation. At a play space level, a couple of the things that you talked about with play, the conversation is more about how do you make your city playful instead of thinking about playgrounds and things. We used to be, I mean, we're very kind of thing culture. You know, you put a thing here and people would interact with it. The conversation is different. How do we make our city playful, and how do we make it enjoyable for children and for people of other ages? Like, for example, instead of putting a small playground in a small constricted space, how do you create some of the games that can be put up with like chalk and paint on the pavement, so people can actually like jump and play, and you know, as they're walking on a sidewalk? Or how do you, you know, one example that I've seen floating around is, you know, this is the silly walk zone written on a portion of the sidewalk. So how when you're walking as a person on the sidewalk, you see that. Not everybody is gonna, you know that Monty Python reference. Not everybody knows what the Ministry of Silly Walks is, but some people might. And that would create a playful moment for the rest of the community. So how do you think differently about play and divorce it from the play equipment and think about playfulness in everything and for everyone? Because adults need to be playful in their city too. Play is not that age boundary that really needs to break down. In terms of restaurants and other social kind of engagement in cities, restaurants spilling onto the sidewalk and into certain parking spots is a welcome change. It's a welcome thing to think about, that essentially when you have a free parking, it's public space open for private occupancy because you put your private vehicle there. So if you swap it with a different kind of private occupancy, that you put a table in 4 people, fair game. I would say, I'm a transportation advocate. I would say fair game. If more people are walking, yes, let's do it. But there is a delicate balance there. How do you keep public space from being taken over by private forces? We would see that everywhere now that restaurants are spilling out. I was walking around my neighborhood yesterday, and Astoria is a huge food neighborhood, and we have so many restaurants. Everybody's outside. And in some places, restaurants have taken the liberty to put their sandwich boards and their barricades right on the sidewalk. So when you're walking through the sidewalk, and our sidewalks are generous here, you feel like you're walking through somebody else's living room. And that creates that tension of public space should feel public. And we've suddenly let the private entity dominate it. So there's that clear balance of to what extent do you let capitalism and market forces do what they want to do? And to what extent do you need to preserve the publicness of public space? Because again, the people who get disenfranchised and marginalized will be the people who are already disenfranchised and marginalized. So
I think that's a great thing to raise, and it makes me think a little of how things spread that are playful, which don't go through app stores at all. A parking day comes to mind. This is the phenomenon, which I think may have started in San Francisco, where people put quarters to pay the parking spot for a day, but don't put a car there. Instead, you maybe put out a table or do whatever. Maybe play a game. I would love more game jams to ask. Let's have everybody think about things we can do in a parking space for a day. A lot of cities are actually encouraging this and letting parking spaces be taken over for a day to rethink what could we do with that space to reimagine our city. I think the times of the coronavirus have actually led to a lot of creativity, and it's one that I feel like I wish the Games for Change community was doing more to share these ideas. Maybe here's a nudge. Anyone that wants to put it in the chat, put one in the chat if you've seen a cool thing. One I've seen in my neighborhood was like the teddy bear hunt, where people would put these teddy bears in their windows and kids would go around trying to find as many teddy bears as they could. The weird thing is that's actually is private space, but it's private space with like a public intention. That almost goes even further. We're like publicizing private windows and encouraging people to look at each other's houses and even to look into their neighbors' houses a tiny bit. People made maps of these, and it's a kind of game design, right? It's a kind of game design that was happening at massive scale. The platform was just kind of crowdsourcing it. So if people have seen this kind of stuff, I think sharing these kind of ideas is great. And to me, the next question is, does the digital help with this in some way? This is where we're starting to see some interesting gains. I think that we're very often focused on apps, for example, but some of the cities are doing some really cool things that aren't with mobile phones at all. The destination, again, doesn't have to go through an app store. Mexico City did a really cool fountain, for example, with some pressure pads. You just put your foot on the ground in the right place, and 50 water jets around the fountain could be controlled and even programmed. You could learn kind of programming and procedural design without ever looking at a screen, but like controlling the order of the fountains. So I think there's a lot of ways in which games and play may not be about like our consumer devices necessarily. So as just kind of an additional piece in there. Maybe I'll turn this over and let either of our panelists have questions for each other or want to pull up anything from the chat as we go.
I also wanted to talk about one example of that. This is something we chatted a little bit about earlier, Benjamin, the porch fest idea, and just having porch placemaking. The first time I heard about it, I was working in Massachusetts. I was in Boston. People talked about Porch Fest, the biggest music festival in Somerville, Massachusetts, that happens entirely on people's private porches. And I thought that's fantastic, because cities and city processes have a lot of red tape. So even though this is a great thing for the community to do, to pull out 100 permits, to have 100 little mini concerts in public space, nightmare. So if people actually do have an eye on the greater good, the good of the community, and actually people having something to do as they're walking in their neighborhood, Porch Fest is a great idea. And people can do things at like smaller space and bigger space and open up your private realm to enrich the public realm, and the other way around. Like, it just builds that relationship of, we are all kind of one community and we're one neighborhood, and it's important for our neighborhood pride and our sense of place for it to be a joyful and nice place for everybody. So it was a really great example.
Games in some ways can also build a sense of excitement and connection to your place, so that when something threatens it, you'll rally to defend it. I think, as I'm a civic person, I'm really interested in the problem with a lot of our civic goods is not that we need to teach people more about like how to vote, because voting isn't hard to do. People don't vote because they don't necessarily feel that connection. So a core to democratic processes is how we have people feel like their vote matters, their action matters. I was really intrigued with Pokemon GO players that some of them really started to feel like their city matters, and they had some thoughts about how it should be changed. One critique I had actually of some of the events that cities ran with it was they did events to kind of launch it, and the mayors and the people from the city never asked the Pokemon players like what we should be doing to change our city. They instead said, come on, gamers, show up. We'll get a lot of people out. And I was like, actually, these gamers have a really interesting perspective on public space. They're moving through it in different ways than the walkers, than the bikers, than the restaurant association. And I think maybe we should be asking them some of how we should improve our place, if only because it legitimizes what they're doing and may help them vote or care or fight for their place the next time. Yennie, have you seen any examples come to mind about people that are getting passionate about their cities through play?
Yeah, so we're kind of constantly asking for this feedback. One very recent example is the local business recovery initiative that we launched, which is us asking players to nominate their most beloved local business as a business for us to hand over kind of our game locations resources on. So for example, if a local bookstore wanted to turn on, let's say, I won't use too technical of a term, but like raids in Pokemon GO, if they wanted to turn on a raid at the bookstore at a certain time when they had, some event going on, they could. And the idea there is really to kind of hand over some of that resource and structure and support to the local business owner versus us at Niantic trying to guess as to when it's helpful to these business owners. The other thing that I was going to mention that I'm very passionate about is trying to hand over that decision making to the community members. So one thing that we're interested in doing is using our technology platform to encourage positive change across lots of different focus areas. One of our partners, Tech Row, they're based in Harlem, and they're specifically focused on providing technology education to underrepresented minorities in Harlem in particular. However, when the pandemic hit, they had to go online, and they've recently launched a whole online initiative that helps youth learn things like augmented reality. And they're working on empowering the youth there to create their own AR experiences to help bring to light some of the sustainability issues in their local neighborhoods. So what's really awesome and powerful about this is that these youth who live in the communities are using the technology to make positive change. And I think that's really where, technology can be used for good.
I want to open it up a little bit for, Nidhi, you want to jump in on that? And then we're going to open up for questions. So anyone that wants to ask a question, there's two modes, which is you can ask a question by video, which I think should be super fun. We should try that. And then we'll also look at the chat. But Nidhi, you had something you want to add?
Yes, I'm going to piggyback on what Yennie just said, actually. This idea of who has the right idea for what the community needs. Urban planning and city design is notorious about this whole expert approach. I can pick on my field, right? This is what I do on a daily basis. Urban planners, the whole field exists because we are the expert and we're supposed to know what's good for a city. Not true, because as I said in the very beginning, place is a psychological construct. It stays in your mind. When you go to a physical space or a virtual space and you create a memory and you have an experience, it becomes a place in your mind and you have a descriptor and you have a story. So it's really about the end user who knows what kind of story they want to have. And if we're trying to create a city for its resident that residents actually like, we have to ask them, what kind of stories do you want to tell? What kind of city do you need? So they are the true experts. The job of the city planner is to be an excellent listener and translator. That's really about it. And we say that at Project for Public Spaces a lot, like the community is the expert. And through the placemaking process, we try to embody that our role is not to know what's good for a community. Our role is to be empathetic and passionate, inquisitive question askers. I know that's not a word, but it's just like, we have to be inquisitive. I know there's a word for it. English, my second language, so everybody's going to forgive me. So it's just, that's really what our role is. We are the facilitators. We ask good questions and we ask it of the right people and they tell us what they want to see in their city.
I think that's a great point. Let's try the video question. If anyone has one, let's see if one pops up. Try it with our moderators. And if someone doesn't, we'll turn to some of the questions in chat. I'll do one provocation as seeing if anyone pops up here, which is what Nidhi just said is a really interesting challenge for a lot of games that are with GPS where there's one game engine serving the entire world. Because how do you be responsive to different communities? That means your engine might need to optimize differently for different places. I think this is the most fundamental critique of global platforms where there's one game that is the same code everywhere. And a kind of crazy idea is we may have an advocacy movement within Games for Change. In fact, I'm going to go out and say, I predict within 5 years, we'll have an advocacy movement that says companies like Niantic need to run different regional versions of their game, and maybe even city specific. Maybe cities need to have different versions of their mechanics where they say, that doesn't work for our city. It's not just about how I walk as a human, which is supposedly fairly universal. It's not just that kind of universal design, but it's actually might be about our city is about the connections, the tight connections between places. And we want to prioritize raids that do that kind of thing, for example. So we need different game optimization for different places in the way that we definitely do for cities. Can you imagine right now for saying, I want to build a park, and we're just going to take the same blueprints that we did in Chicago and we'll put it here. Like no city would ever do that. We don't let cities do that. And so I think this is a fundamental tension when we head with games in the direction of city and urban planning. So, okay, let's, any other questions on the video? Come on, somebody give it a try.
Okay, we have one.
Oh, that's me. Hello.
Hello.
I feel there. Do you hear me on time? Sorry about that. Okay, so the thing is, I studied city planning, and I'm very interested in climate change, and I'm trying to gamify solving it with a very spatially located dimension. And what we're focused on is, in order to solve it, like greenhouse gases come from power plants. And so really just, that's one area. So like the energy supply field. And the way to fix that is to get rid of the fossil plants and replace them with clean energy, right? But the problem is everybody's all great about like, let's ban the fossils, but they're not great about let's, slap down some solar farms here. Let's put a wind turbine here. It's all the NIMBY coefficient. So, so this isn't that fun. I mean, it's like neighbor, it's the conflict you're talking about. But what we're trying to do is get people to really grasp the situation, because we have to, we have to make these decisions. And so the urban area is kind of, so again, I don't know if this is more focused on urban or rural, but, urban areas are big consumers. They use up a lot of the energy, and rural is where a lot of this stuff would go. So our game is kind of like a football field, like the first gigawatt down, what's it going to take to replace the energy? And we really want people to see it, and then to know where that's going to go, and that you're fighting the NIMBY coefficient wherever you go, until kind of it's like a NIMBY bid rent war, to figure out where these things end up, and also where to pivot, because at some point people are like, yeah, you know what, let's really use less energy. Like once you realize that. So I guess we're working more on the mechanics of trying to get people to see what's involved in actually winning. And then I'm here looking for experts on the game side of it. But like, I definitely want to inject that issue and the conflict. Like, we really want to surface that, because people are like hand waving, oh, we'll just get some panels somewhere. That somewhere is somebody's backyard, and they're going to be, annoyed by it. So
Maybe I'm going to take that question and just push it a little in the pub, and maybe mute if you're not talking, because I think we're getting an echo there.
I just did that.
Okay, excellent. So, I think that I think one of the interesting tensions with the games is that if we ask public space to serve the same ends, like we wanted, you're going to build a playground and it's supposed to give people information about climate. How would you even do that, or connection? I think a lot of that work in public planning, it says, no, that's about the meetings before you get there, that people would learn about the process and the consequences and the trade-offs. But maybe actually public space sometimes wants you to know about how we got there as well. So maybe Nidhi, is public space educational? Because it sounds like that's a little of the direction that we're headed. We want people to learn something about climate change. I'm kind of trying to adapt the question a little bit.
Yes,
Forgive me.
it is. Public space is public space work and placemaking has an inherent element of advocacy built into it. And you would change your approach depending on community to community, because as I said, we wouldn't want to come in and tell the community, this is your biggest problem and this is the solution you need. And what that does is, I will actually spell out the NIMBY, not in my backyard, not everybody might know. So what that does is, when somebody from the outside, not of your community, not looking like you, not sounding like you, tells you what's best for you, it puts you on the wrong first step. So what you would want to do is create the right first step. You would want them to be as angry about the footprint of one particular product as you are. And that would inherently start with education, like ways in which you can just share what is happening to their community and actually link it to a source. You want the community to be enraged. Well, maybe not enraged, advocating themselves and educated themselves. So the idea that in the end you want to advocate for becomes the community's idea. So it has to come from them. This is like basic of placemaking and human-centered design, is that somehow you want to take an approach so that your solution doesn't come from you. The right solution actually comes from the community. They feel like it's their idea. So they feel attached to that solution, and so that they would want to fight for it, vote for the right candidate for it, and whatever it would take. and it takes the burden off of the actual implementation of the solution off of your shoulders. It still doesn't make it easy because education is not easy, and building 100 advocates out of you one advocate is not easy work, but it just shifts the power. It gives the power back to the community in that way. I actually wanted to address one of the things you said earlier also, Benjamin, now that I have the mic for a second. You were talking about, no two places are designed the same way. Asking communities is kind of the right way. I think we're far from designing cities in a human-centered way still, which is why we get cities that are ableist, cities that are still great for men, cities that are still great for wealthy people, and not their most vulnerable populations, because we're not great at asking people. So cities, again, COVID has shown us the fractures by showing who is dying because of this pandemic, and that shows that there is a big gap for us to still fill to truly be human-centered, whether that's city design, rural design, or at any scale.
I think that let's give Yennie a chance to also respond to this, and I want to keep opening it for questions, or we only have a couple of minutes left. I want to make sure we get to several questions. Yennie, have you guys done anything with climate change, or did you have any ideas based on the question?
Yeah, I mean, I think Nidhi answered it perfectly. From a game-centric approach, we certainly have done great activities like our Earth Day campaign that we try to do every year. It specifically is focused on connecting local players to local nonprofits that are hosting cleanup events, and really just kind of encouraging that community engagement, connecting the players to the local organizations versus more global, and focusing it on the hyper-local community itself. But I want to keep time for other questions as well.
Great. Do we have another video question? Excellent. We'll take one from Eric, and then I see some in the chat as well.
Hi, thank you all. So I had a question, and Ben, you sort of went down this road a little bit with regard to the notion of an engine, and I'm wondering if any of you have experiences where working with dependencies, build process and deployment process. So these are all choices that designers make. Niantic, Google Maps platform, a Unity API. To what extent have these dependencies inhibited civic action engagement, or pushed it in particular directions that you've had to think about more open-ended solutions?
So I think I understand the question, but correct me if I'm wrong. You're right. There are definitely limitations there, and there are always trade-offs. Beyond just the systems that we use, we have partners on every title that we work on. There is, policy in countries, cities, states that all impact what we use, and that's kind of an ongoing conversation, like I mentioned earlier. I think then we start to think about, well, how do we make a game where the user is placed first, right? Their privacy, their protection is first always. And then we kind of go from there. Like I mentioned earlier, it's an ever-evolving conversation based on, different suitabilities wherever in the world we are. It's kind of a unique aspect to having products that are played globally. When we look at the US, we think a lot about how can we encourage action, and then just back off from there. So earlier, Ben mentioned voting and civic engagement in particular. And, we would want to say, well, we want to encourage people to participate and vote, right? How can we do that? Well, we have lots of game locations all around. Could we think about showing people where polling places are? Because believe it or not everyone knows, right? In my neighborhood, there's tons, and they're always the same location, but that's not the case in a lot of places. And so thinking about unique ways that we can just help give information to people and to players, and then let them do with it what they will. Did that answer your question?
And for me, it's sort of a challenge, because you have to make a design choice at some point that then suggests these are all the features, these are all the plugins. It's a process where you center the user, but it is a process of slow exclusionary choices as a design solution.
Yeah, I'd also add it is a policy question. And I think that we've been trained with technology to think of it as, here's the tools we've given. You can choose Unity, you can use this, and it's all these tools provided by corporations that where is policy in this? But actually things like the National Historic Register of Places, right? What gets included, what doesn't? Those are huge democratic questions, and different cities have very different approaches to what's included. And should games have to include places that are on the list? Well, what if, we're systematically excluding certain people's history? Those are policy questions, and most of the platform operators, the Niantics, forgive, and others are in the room are just like, we don't really want to get in the middle of that. But guess what? That's what also most of the government is saying. We don't want to get in the middle of that. So everybody's avoiding the policy questions that are coming up about data and public space when these are actually part of our public assets and public good. And the engines aren't the only piece. It's like engines and data. I think that the Games for Change community should be at the forefront of this, and all of us should be thinking it's need to look out for the user and fight for the user. We also have to think about what are the policy implications and fight for policy. Increasingly, these are the things that our democracy should be battling, not just who has access to historic buildings, but what's even on the register in Niantic's database, because that determines who goes there. So let's open it up for another question, unless Nidhi wanted to jump in. And also our panelists, if you wanted to pull on any of the questions from the chat, there've been a few from there, if you want to jump in on any of those.
I see a question about smart cities. It's more in the context of gamification for increasing community agency and building resilience. I think smart cities, from the urbanist perspective, my perspective, is already a loaded term, because there are two inherent questions to it: smart for who and smart how. Are we? Because oftentimes when you say smart cities, people's mind goes to technology, as if technology is going to solve some of the more basic problems that people have. And from a transportation advocacy point of view, if people don't believe that they should be able to get to their destinations without having to drive all the time, or whether their cities should be friendly for people walking and friendly for people pushing strollers and in wheelchairs and things like that, if you don't ask those questions, then technology may not necessarily solve things for you. So the idea of who are smart cities for and smart how, are they equal for everybody? Do they allow for equal access? Or do they allow people who already have 4 ways of accessing information, do they now get a 5th and 6th way? So that question is, I guess, even more to answer prior to getting into how that happens.
Yeah, I would echo that smart cities is a great frame for starting to imagine a possible future where we could interact with more parts of our city. But another side to what Nidhi is talking about, the practical realities, is that the user for most smart city apps is government. It's actually not even end users. We're looking for a contract from the city to do something with a data set. And most of the people in the city that are making those choices are technocrats who have very little idea of what actually end users, and aren't even really accountable to end users. So to me, one of the biggest problems in terms of our design ecosystem that is going to make smart cities actually smart for a broader set of people is that things like community planning meetings are like totally off the table. We would never go to a community planning meeting for our smart city questions. Instead, I'm going to design a really great thing and I'm going to sell it to Philadelphia, and then they'll give it to all their citizens. Or maybe I'll just skip Philadelphia and I'll give it straight to the users and cut out all of our civic infrastructure and associations along the way. So I think I think there's a real interesting question about how we'll design for smart cities along the way. Great question. So another question that was coming in, Yennie, did you have any you wanted to jump in on?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions around building a global village and, continuing to kind of support the world as we evolve. We've had a pretty strong stance on equal rights, and I'll post our latest blog post on the Black Lives Matter program and commitment that we have made for the long term. For us, human rights and equality is not a 1-month type campaign. It's ongoing and it's ever evolving, which I think has kind of been a theme of my discussion today. And that's the same goes for, game locations. Someone mentioned ingress portals. It's the same thing as Pokemon Go stops and gyms. And always and actively working on managing our game location database to reflect the real world and true history. So as, for example, monuments are taken down, we are also obviously taking those down in our games. And we're actively working with some pretty amazing organizations that are focused on bringing to light things like Black history, and using those partnerships to activate new game locations, where people can tell their stories. So earlier, we talked about the political nature of putting historic places on the National Register and that sort of thing. And instead, we're starting to speak to local organizations that are telling the history of, historically marginalized communities and putting those into game locations, so that those folks can tell their stories in their truth. So I'm really excited about that. Again, it's an ongoing, ever evolving communication, but we're trying to flip the classic tech company thing on its head and instead build for, the world versus the bubble that some of us live in here in Silicon Valley.
We are at our time. I'm sure that you can reach out to any of us to follow up. Nidhi, did you have anything else you wanted to add about, you've come to a games conference and probably we're a little bit of an unusual group of people for you to be talking to, or anything you want to urge or encourage for future conversations?
Absolutely. I would want people to think about the idea of equitable city a little bit more, because the kinds of power systems and structures we need to topple are much bigger. When people go to architecture school, urban planning school, any kind of planning, transportation planning school, public policy school, just think about whose text you're reading, who wrote that book. And more often than not, I found in architecture school, it was a European white man, American white man, some white man who wrote that book telling me what good architecture is, what good design is, and it becomes part of who you are. And that's where it starts. And then you look at your planning manuals, you look at your architecture standards. Like every time you follow a manual that applies to games, cities, designing anything, question where that manual comes from, whose voice is it, and how equitable is that voice, and how do you challenge that? But how do you also then not just challenge it, but topple it and make it different? So we'll be here talking about these things for many years to come.
Well, I think that we can also take that as an urging to think about games and play for wherever you are. So maybe to bring that back to where we started, each of us is coming from a different city, which is kind of an amazing thing. Games for Change has never had this kind of simultaneousness in different places, multiple places coming together. I might then say, let's all go think about the kinds of play and who gets to make it and who is part of that play as we go back, as we return to public space, or just try to make it through the next month of this insanity. So Yennie, anything you wanted to add as final remarks?
Just really excited about what all of us can do. This organization, Games for Change, and its festival brings together a really amazing group of people. And so I'm really excited to see what the next year brings for all of us.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you online. We hope to see what you make for your cities, or what you critique and change and tear down from the play in your places. It's great been talking with you. And thank you so much to Nidhi and Yennie. It is really an exceptional honor to have both of you here in this conversation. So thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks for having us.